At Saddleback, we say that small groups are not a ministry of the church. Small groups are not a program of the church. Small groups are not an outreach of the church. Small groups are not an event of the church. Small groups are the church. It is the church. It is the purest expression of the church. It is the church. The weekend is not the church. It's the crowd. A crowd is not a church. A lot of guys build a crowd and think they got a church. No, they just have a crowd. The crowd can be turned into a church. And if you want a big church, you got to have a big crowd to get there. The crowd is not a church. The weekend is just a funnel. Sometimes I'll hear people and staff say, it's all about the weekend. They're dead wrong. They're just dead wrong. If all you have is the weekend, you have an event, not a church, not a fellowship, not a koinonia, not a congregation. It is the funnel by which you're going to move them into the church. And if you have a strategy like Purpose Driven, where you bring them in, you build them up, you teach them how, and you send them out, then you can build a church. And when I started Saddleback, now we started our 40th year in January. I was 25 years old when I started this church. I had one member, my wife. I preached the first sermon. She said it was too long. It's been downhill ever since. She still says it's too long. So nobody started smaller than I did. I started with one member, my wife. But as we've watched it grow, and we went from 1 service to 2 services to 3 services to 4 services to 5 services to 6 services. And for a decade, I preached 6 services every weekend. 2 Saturday night, 2 Sunday morning, 2 Sunday night. Then I was about ready to die. And we had to figure out another way to do it, and that's when the whole idea of venues came along, which was a kind of an interim step to multi-site. And now we have 19 or 20, depending on how you count. If we count Dana Point or not, it's not a full church, but they do have services down there. And that has allowed me a breather to go back to just 4 services instead of 6. But I'm not impressed with the size of a crowd. I could teach any of you how to get a crowd. It's not that hard. You just have to meet needs and love people. If you genuinely love people, love attracts. If a church is known for love, you'd have to lock the doors to keep people out, because people are looking for love, just in all the wrong places. But the issue is, what do you do with them? How do you turn an unbeliever into a believer and a believer into a disciple? How do you turn a disciple into a minister? And how do you turn a minister into a missionary? You've got to move them into groups. And as you've heard, we have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of small groups in this church. Saddleback is the only church in America that I know of, at least the only large one, that has more people in small groups than come on the weekend. On a typical weekend, we might have 29,000, 30,000 people show up for church at all of our campuses. But during the week, we can have as high as 40,000, and during campaigns, as high as 45,000 people in small groups. We've had as high, I don't know what it is right now, but we've had as high as 8,422 groups. Every city in Southern California has Saddleback small groups in it. We're in 196 cities. From Santa Monica to San Diego, every single city in Southern California has Saddleback groups in it. That's why when we get ready to start, a campus, like we were getting ready to start Huntington Beach campus, I said, how many groups we got in Huntington Beach? 400. 400. Now, I can teach you, and actually Steve can teach you how to do that, but we can't teach you how to do it quickly. It took 39 years. So those huge numbers I just told you, it didn't happen overnight. It took 39 years of consistent, systematic, sequential, loving people, trusting people, training people, building into people, building leaders. I can teach any of you how to grow a church. I cannot teach you how to do it quickly. In fact, when you see a church that grows from like 0 to 4,000 in like a couple of years, that's not normal growth. It's actually transfer growth every time. It's what happens if somebody comes in town, they have to have a good communicator, and a lot of Christians go from other churches over to that place. That's not legitimate growth. God has called us to be fishers of men, not keepers of the aquarium and transferring fish back and forth. And what's the new? So I'm not impressed when I see a church go from 0 to 3,000 or 4,000. We didn't grow that way. On the 5th year of Saddleback Church, we still had 500 people, not 5,000. And it was systematic year after year after year. Well, you got to know how to bring them in. You got to know how to build them up. You got to know how to teach them and train them for leadership, and you got to know how to send them out. Of course, as you've heard, you know, we use a baseball diagram just as a visual. Getting them to first base, that's those 50,000 baptized and into the membership of Saddleback Church and taking class 101. Then we get them to second base, and they sign the maturity covenant, and we get them in a small group. And once people are in a small group, I stop worrying about them, because I know their needs are going to be taken care of. Now, you know, anywhere else in the world, a small group's called a house church. Only in America do we call them small groups. But anywhere else, it's a house church. And you remember that the first 300 years of the church, there were no weekend services. There were no church buildings for 300 years. I've been in one of the earliest churches. It was built in 312 AD up in Malula, Syria. It's now full of bullet holes because of the civil war there. But it's one of the earliest and still standing churches. And it seats maybe 75 people. But for 300 years we had no church buildings, and yet that was the fastest period of growth of the church, where we went from, 120 people in the upper room to all of a sudden it's the official religion of the Roman Empire 300 years later. That's pretty big growth without buildings. When I started Saddleback, I wanted to prove that you don't have to have a building to grow a church. We went 15 years without a building. This church was running over 10,000 before we built our first building. In the first 13 years, we used 79 different facilities. And every time we outgrow a building, we move to another one. And after at one point, I was using 4 different high schools in the same week. We'd have Sunday night one place, Sunday morning another place, Saturday night another place, midweek another place. We said, we're the church, if you can figure out where you are this week, you get to come. Because we only want really intelligent people. And if you can't find us, you're not smart enough. I'm teasing. But the bottom line is you don't need a lot of stuff to grow a church. What you do need is you need love. And you can't love a crowd. Love can only happen when you got 4 people or 6 people or 8 people or 10 people. In small groups, small really is better. Small really is better. 4 is better than 6. 6 is better than 8. 8 is better than 10. You get more than 10 people in a small group, somebody stops talking. And the person with the most outgoing personality will tend to dominate the larger the group becomes, just like I'm doing right now. And so, really, small is better. And one of the values of Saddleback, as you said, is, as I said earlier, small groups are not a program of the church. They are the church. It is the church. It's where koinonia takes place. It's where the church happens. It's more important than anything else, because that's where 58 times in the New Testament the phrase one another is used. Love one another. Care for one another. Pray for one another. Encourage one another. Greet one another. Serve one another. Share with one another. And on and on and on. It is the 58 one another's of the mutual ministry of the body of Christ. That cannot take place in a crowd. So I'm preaching this constantly. You got to be in a group. You're not really a part of this church unless you're in a group. And that's how we have more people in small groups than actually come on Sunday morning. But we don't even leave them at second base. We move them to third base, which is we train them for their ministry. And we have about 25,000 people who've been trained in ministry. We have over 500 ministries that work out in the community during the week. I don't even know them all anymore. There's just so many things going on. But even that's not enough. Maturity is not an end in itself. Maturity is for ministry. Ministry is not an end in itself. You've got to move them around to home plate, bring them home, grand slam disciple, which is mission. Send them out. Bring them in, build them up, teach them how, send them out. Bring them in, build them up, teach them how, send them out. Small group planning integral part in all four of those things of disciple building. Bring them in, build them up, teach them how to train them for the ministry, and send them out. So we're the first generation that can actually go to every nation. So I said, why don't we be the first church in 2,000 years of history to actually go to every nation? To actually send our members to every nation. And our members go, so why not? Let's do it. So we launched this thing called the Peace Plan. And we can train your church on how to do this. And we set a goal that by the end of 2010, Saddleback members would be PEACE, plant churches, equip leaders, assist the poor, care for the sick, educate the next generation. PEACE, 5 things Jesus did in every nation. And we began to send them out by the hundreds, and then by the thousands. And over that next 8 years, I sent out 25,869 of my members to all 197 nations in the world. Now, when we started, I didn't even know how many nations there were. So we're going to go to every nation. How many are there? I don't know. So I had to look it up. There are 197 nations in the world. There used to be 196, but Sudan split into North and South Sudan. There are 195 nations in the United Nations. The only 2 nations not in the United Nations are Taiwan and Serbia for war crimes, and China won't let Taiwan in. Even North Korea has visitor status. I've spoken to the United Nations. And what we discovered was there aren't that many nations. There are less than 200 actual nations in the world. So he said, let's be the first church to go to every nation. We start sending people out to do PEACE. On October 18th, 2009, right at the end of the decade, no, it was November 18th, we went to Nation 197. There's a little island in the Caribbean called St. Kitts, only 35,000 people. That said, we're not going to leave out Nation 197. We sent a team there to plant a church, equip leaders, assist the poor, care for the sick, educate the next generation. We're the only church in 2,000-year history to go to every nation. Now, why am I telling you all these statistics? Because it wouldn't happen without small groups. We wouldn't have baptized 50,000 people. I wouldn't have 25,000 people serving in ministry. I wouldn't now have close to 28,000 people who've served on mission. You realize I preach every Sunday to a church of missionaries. My church has gone overseas. When you come back from Botswana, you don't care about a tennis bracelet anymore. When you've seen the real world and how most of the world is, you just don't care about a lot of material things anymore. So I pastor a church of missionaries. It all started with the concept of building small groups. We send our teams out in small groups. Jesus never, ever sent out individuals. Never. Not once in his entire ministry did he send out anybody on their own on mission. Not once. The lone missionary is a myth. He sent them out. The minimum was by 2. But he would often send them by groups. And Paul never traveled by himself. He always went in a small group. He took a small group with him. He even tells us who they are. He says there's Aristarchus, and there's Secundus, and there's Epaphroditus, and there's Timothy, and there's Luke. He names these guys who are in his small group, who are traveling with him. Now, twice in the New Testament, it says that the new believers in Christ met in the temple courts and from house to house. Temple courts and house to house. In the temple courts. Now, they did not meet in the temple because only the priest could actually go inside the temple. So a Jew couldn't go in the temple. They could go in the temple courts. If you've been to Jerusalem, the temple courts around Solomon's temple would easily hold 50,000 people standing. So they could have big Sunday service in the temple courts. But they also met during the week, house to house, where they did communion, Bible study, and worship, and all these different things. And so the New Testament model for a healthy church is large group worship and small group fellowship, temple courts and house to house. And those 2 things create the yin and the yang of a healthy church. Large group worship, small group fellowship, temple courts, house to house. And if you get that done, you'll grow a healthy church. It's when you start adding on all this other stuff that isn't in the Bible that starts making the church so busy going to meetings that they don't have time to know their neighbor and have a barbecue and win them to Christ. Most Christians don't know their neighbors. Why? One of the worst things is that the longer you're a Christian, the fewer non-believers you know. Because you spend all your time with believers. I don't even think like a Christian. I think like a pastor. That's 2 generations removed from reality. And so the most effective evangelists in your church are not your old Christians. It's the brand new ones. Because they still have all the contacts. They're the ones who aren't afraid of non-believers because they were one 5 minutes ago. But the longer you're a Christian, the more you start fearing non-believers. And they feel alien to you. So, the first thing you just need to accept is that what you're doing is the church. It's not an extension of the church. It's not a program of the church. It is the church. Temple courts and house to house. It's half of the New Testament model. That's why I talk about it all the time. The second thing you need to remember is that if the small groups are the cells of the body of Christ, the body of Christ is not one giant cell. Your body is not one giant cell. Your body is millions of little cells. And in a body of Christ, the body of Christ in your town, in your church, is made up of cells. And your church is only as healthy as the cells are. If the cells aren't healthy, then the church isn't healthy. Does that make sense? Okay. And another thing you need to realize is that in every cell of your body is all the DNA of your body. All the DNA of your body. 25 years ago, I wrote a book called Purpose Driven Church. And there's some things in there we don't even believe anymore. Maybe I should tell them to you. But one of them is, in the early days, we used to specialize our small groups. And there were some that were specializing in evangelism. And there were some that specialized in ministry. And some specialized in discipleship. We're a discipleship group. We study for that. And some that specialized in fellowship. We're a fellowship group. And some specialized in worship. We just get together and we worship. That's not a healthy church. That's not a healthy group. For a group to be healthy, it has to have all the DNA. Every church, every small group must have all 5 purposes in it. It must worship. Your small group must worship. It must fellowship. It must disciple. It must grow, mature. It must minister. A non-serving group is a contradiction. Like a non-serving Christian is a contradiction. And it must do outreach. It must reach out. It must have a mission. So all of the DNA, all 5 purposes of God. You know there are 5 purposes of God for the church. Not 6, not 7, not 4, not 2. There are 5. I could give you 100 books written over the last 1,000 years that would tell you whether you're Catholic or an Orthodox or Episcopal or Evangelical or Pentecostal, that there are 5 purposes of the church. Worship, fellowship, discipleship, ministry, and evangelism. Those 5 purposes are modeled in Acts 2. Those 5 purposes are prayed for by Jesus in John 17. Those 5 purposes are explained by Paul in Ephesians 4. But they are best summarized in 2 statements of Jesus, the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. If you get the Great Commission and the Great Commandment, you'll grow a great church. That's the theme of Saddleback Church. I invite you to steal it. It's fine. A great commitment to the Great Commandment and a Great Commission will grow a great church. A great commitment to the Great Commandment and Great Commission will grow a great Christian. A great commitment to a Great Commission and a Great Commandment will grow a great company, or a great city, or a great community, or a great country. These are the twin pillars of Jesus. One day Jesus walking down the street, one day a guy comes up and says, "What's the most important thing?" Oh, that's easy. I'm going to summarize it in 2 sentences. I'm going to give you all the law and the prophets. I'm going to summarize the entire Bible. This is Cliff Notes on the Bible. Here it is. Simple. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the first 2 purposes of the church. Now, what is that called? To love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength is called worship. Worship is simply expressing my love to God. Every time I express my love to God in any way, whether I'm by myself, in a small group, or with 500 people, I'm worshiping. Worship is expressing my love to God. It's telling God you love Him. Love your neighbors yourself, that's called ministry. And Jesus said, even if you give a cup of cold water in my name, that counts. And so the first two purposes of your life and the first two purposes of your church are worship and ministry. Love God and serve others. Love them through service. So we get two of the purposes of the church and two of the purposes for every small group out of the Great Commandment. We get the other three purposes out of the Great Commission. There are 5 verbs in these 2 sentences. And in the Great Commission, he says, go make disciples, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and, oh, by the way, teach them to do everything I've commanded you. And those are the 3 purposes of evangelism. Go make disciples. Okay, that's evangelism. Teach them to do everything I've taught you, commanded you. That's discipleship. Now, between the twin goals of evangelism and discipleship says, oh, by the way, baptize them into the body of Christ. Bring them in. Don't just make believers, make belongers. We're not just called to believe, we're called to belong. And this is the incorporation purpose, or fellowship. You're not just baptized, you're baptized into the body of Christ. You're putting on the uniform saying, I'm in. Baptism is the coming out party. It's the coming out of the closet for a believer. I'm in. A little boy asked me one time, Pastor Rick, when can I get advertised? And I said, that's pretty good, because that's what baptism is. It's an advertisement for Jesus. It says, I am not ashamed to say, I love Jesus Christ. I love Him with all my heart. And if He never did anything else for me, I'm going to serve Him the rest of my life. That's what keeps me going. I've been serving the Lord now almost 50 years. What keeps me going? I love Jesus Christ. I love Him with all my heart. And if He never did anything else for me, I will serve Him. And as long as I have breath, I will offer my body as a living sacrifice. And I will do things that wear me out. Because He died for me. So the DNA of all 5 purposes has to be in every small group for it to be healthy. It has to have worship elements. It has to have fellowship elements. It has to have service elements. It has to have, mission elements. And of course, it has to have growth or discipleship in the Word of God. So that's pretty standard stuff. But really what I came to tell you this morning, and I believe this with the depth of my heart, I've been thinking about it for the better part of the last year, is that in the next 10 years, I've been watching the trends of our society now for years. And the world is very different today, 40 years later, after I started Saddleback. This is not 1980s. It's not 1990s. It's not even the 2000s. The society has changed drastically, radically, from when I was 25 years old and started this church. Now, the purposes never change because they're eternal. But how you do those purposes has to change with every generation. You don't get to choose the purposes of your church, sorry. If you don't do these 5 things, you're not a perfect church. You're a social club. So we don't get to say, what's going to be our purpose? It's already been determined. Jesus said, I will build my church. He decided what the purposes of the church are. But we do get to choose the style and the methodologies by which we fulfill. There are lots of ways to worship. And there are lots of ways to fellowship. And there are lots of ways to disciple believers. And there are lots of ways to serve and minister. And there are lots of ways to do evangelism and mission. We don't get to choose the purposes, but we do get to choose how, when, where. And that gives us a lot of great freedom. And those have to change because the world is changing. I made a list and shared it with my team a year ago, our elders, of what I call 10 crucial trends in our society. I'm not going to go through all of those, but I want to just talk to you about one of them. Because the antidote to every one of these trends is in the small group. So what you're doing, what you're leading, is actually going to become excruciatingly important, particularly in the next 10 years, as we change cultures. One of the trends in the society is an anti-attitude toward Christians. So people who might have been more open to coming to church are less open to coming to church. And even the term evangelical is now a political term. And people say, well, evangelicals do this, and evangelicals are racist, and evangelicals are prejudiced. I'm going, that's not me. Are you kidding me? Prejudice? Saddleback is probably the most racially multicultural, diverse church in America. We speak 67 languages in this church. Of my 20 campus pastors, most of them are not white guys. We got African American, we got Hispanic, we got Middle Eastern, we've got Asian, we got Latino. Of my 20 pastors, most of them are not white guys. My staff is multicultural. We speak 67 languages, so don't call me a racist. When that Charlottesville thing happened a year ago, remember when that happened? I was actually on vacation with my family in Mexico. And to see guys in brown shirts carrying torches and saying anti-black statements and anti-Jew statements, I began to boil over. I'm going, is this America 21st century or Germany 1930? What is happening to our country? This blatant racism, bigotry. And it made me so upset that from Mexico, I sent an email to the 100 most influential pastors in America. And I said, if this thing about racism bothers you like it bothers me, show up, it was on Friday, at Rancho Capistrano on Monday, and we're going to meet right here in this room. And we're going to say, well, what are we going to do? And about 25, if I told you the names of these guys, you'd know them all. They're all well-known guys. 25% of them were black guys. 25% of them were Hispanic guys. 25% of them were Asian or Middle East guys. And about 25% of them were white guys. And we all sat around here in a horseshoe table, and I said, we're just going to go around the room and tell your story. And we sat there and cried through everybody's story. Because everybody has experienced some kind of rejection. And to hear stories of people telling when they were kids, and you go, well, I get it. I understand why it hurt. But the church is going to have to take the lead in a number of different ways. But let me go back to what I was saying. Because the word evangelical and because the word Christian has a negative connotation for a sizable portion of our society today. It's considered this and this and this and this, you name it. I don't think that the church's front door is going to be the worship service much longer. I think we're going to reach more people through the side doors than the front doors. Now, let me give you a model of this. I have a Mormon neighbor. And if my Mormon neighbor came to me and goes, Rick, you got to come to church with me this weekend. It's incredible. The music, you're going to love it. It's incredible. We got this band, and they are hot. And we got lighting, and we got smoke machines, and it's just really good music. And we got free Starbucks coffee. And we've got donuts, free. They're really good. They're fresh. And we got incredible child care for your children. And parking, we got valet parking. And you can come up and we'll actually park your car for you. And you don't have to dress up. You can wear flip-flops and a t-shirt and shorts. And he gives me like 25 different features. And in my mind I'm going, I don't care. I just want to be a Mormon. There is no feature that your church can offer that's going to make me want to be a Mormon. Because in my mind, a Mormon is this. You know what I'm talking about? So there's no feature you can ask. Well, we've got this special celebrity guest coming. I don't care. I don't want to be a Mormon. There's nothing you could say that's going to make me want to be a Mormon. A lot of people are like that with Christianity now. Because the word has taken on a negative term. And it's been politicized. And it's been there's all kinds of problems with it. What breaks my heart is that the bride of Christ has mud on her face. And her beautiful white dress has been sullied. And her hair has been messed up. And I want to see the beauty of the bride of Christ restored in our nation. We will either have revival or America will go the way of Europe, which it lost its soul. And in a vacuum, nature abhors a vacuum. Islam has moved into that vacuum in Europe. We will either have a fourth great awakening, which I pray for, or we will continue in our decline and we will have different kinds of ministry. I went back and reread Augustine's City of God. The City of God was written in about 400-something AD, in the fall of Rome. By that time, Rome was looked not as the enemy of Christianity, but as the supporter of Christianity. It was the official religion. And when Rome fell, the Christians goes, what's going to happen to our faith? The city of God, Rome, has fallen. What's going to happen? And Augustine writes, goes, the culture's going to the pagans. By this time, Rome, Christianity was the primary thing in Rome, and all these great cathedrals and stuff. The one thing I can say about Christianity is, and one thing I say about the future is, I don't know what life's going to be in 100, 200, 500. But if 1,000 years from today, Jesus Christ still hasn't come back, I don't know, we're to be ready at any moment. But if he hasn't come back in 1,000 years, well, I can tell you this. There won't be a Microsoft in 1,000 years. There won't be an Apple. There won't be a Starbucks. Shoot, there won't be a United States of America. Why? Because no human thing lasts forever. No empire lasts. Where's the Roman Empire? It's gone. Where's the Hittite Empire? Where's the Ugaritic Empire? Where's the Assyrian Empire? Where's the Sumerian Empire? Where's the Hittite Empire? They're all gone. Everything. One thing you can say about any dictator or president, they won't be here for long. It's just a window. And the church has outlasted every dictator, has outlasted every poor leader, has outlasted every attack, war, cult, criticism, persecution. Persecution is actually good for the church. Wherever the church is persecuted, it grows. But I'm saying that the idea of building a, quote, an attractive church where the front door is we offer all these cool things isn't going to cut it in the next generation. So how do you do the purposes in a new way that attract a new generation? Acts 13:36, David served God's purpose in his generation. Then he died. That's my life verse. I want to serve God's purpose in my generation when I die. Who wants to stay around here anyway? Well, it's God's through with you. You do the timeless in a timely way. You do that which never changes in a world that's constantly changing. You do that which is eternal in a contemporary and relevant way. You serve God's purpose in your generation. And by the way, you can't serve God's generation in anybody else's generation. There are some people who think the golden age of Christianity is the Reformation. They'd like to go back to that. There's some people who think the golden age is the 1950s. They'd like to go back to that. You can't go back to any. You can only serve God's purpose in your generation right now. And here's what we've got. We've got a generation that is increasingly not interested in coming to church. What is going to attract? How do we win people in a thing where it's not low-hanging fruit? Throw open your doors and say you all come and have something nice and offer them a nice seat and comfortable parking. How are you going to reach people like that? Okay, I want you to listen closely. I've studied this my entire life. People come to Christ when they're in transition or under tension. You might write that down. People come to Christ when they're in transition or under tension. They come to Christ when they're in pain. God speaks to us, whispers to us in our pleasure, C.S. Lewis said, and shouts to us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone. And so I highly recommend that you stop trying to reach everybody in your community and just start focusing on the people who are in pain. Leave the happy pagans alone because they will get in pain eventually. But don't worry about, Jesus said in the sower of the fields, he said there are 4 kinds of soil. And when you sow the seed, there's, the hard ground that it doesn't even come up, and then there's the rocky ground and it comes up a little bit and dies, and there's the rock ground with weeds, and then there's the good soil. Of the 4 kinds of soil, the good soil, and that plants and it multiplies 50, 25, 100-fold, and you have great fruit. Now, if that's true, and of course Jesus never said anything that wasn't true, if there are 4 kinds of soil, and those represent 4 kinds of heart, the hard heart, the conflicted heart, the hard-hearted, the busy heart, and the open heart. If that's true, Jesus is saying only 25% of the people out there are open. That 75% of the soil is not going to receive the seed. Does that make sense? 75% of society out there is not going to be interested in the good news of Jesus Christ. But there's 25% out there that, man, when it gets that seed, it catches it and it grows. I'm begging you to start focusing on the 25%. And that's the people in pain. It is not my job to prepare the soil. It's my job to plant the seed where it'll grow the best. It is God's job to prepare the soil. God is in the hard cultivation business, not me. How does God turn hard soil into good soil? How does he turn dead bedrock, the seed just lays on top, into something that will receive the seed? How does God turn hard into soft? Hard. He sends a storm. He sends rain. And when the rain comes down long enough on that hard soil, it gets soft, and it gets softer, and it gets softer, and eventually the seed can be in. I think more people are going to be brought to Christ through the relationships in small groups than any front door evangelism in the next 15 to 20 years. You're hearing it from me. You're hearing it from me. This makes what you do more important than the weekend. As I said, people are always attracted to love. And where do you show love? You can't show love in a crowd. Oh, turn to the person next to you and say, I love you. That's weird. You might get picked up for a Me Too moment right there. Okay? I don't want any businessman saying to a teenage girl, I love you. Excuse me, I'd like to change seats right now. And so only in authentic community can you have authentic love. And that's why the value of small groups is so, so important. I know we're running out of time, so let me just say, of the 10 trends, the one that I'm most concerned about, because it's I want to give you a little homework assignment. I want you to go home and type into Google the epidemic of loneliness. The epidemic of loneliness. Loneliness is the number one epidemic in our society today. Studies in America say about half of Americans say, I'm lonely. I am lonely. You can be married and lonely. It's interesting, we have more technology to connect us, and yet that kind of connection actually creates dissatisfaction. Studies have shown that the more teenage girls are on social media, the more lonely they feel. because everybody's presenting my so-called perfect life, and I feel like I'm missing out, and I feel like, oh, look at the fun they're having, and you had a beautiful latte. I don't have a beautiful latte, and it's all this comparison is just ridiculous, and so social media is not creating connections; it's creating false intimacy. It's false intimacy. And it's not the real deal. Intimacy happens face to face. Okay? Can you use social media? Of course you can. Of course you can. I have almost 8 million followers on Facebook and 2.5 million on Twitter. And with all of the, I have about 10 million followers on social media. I use it to plant seeds, but I'm certainly not trying to use it to build relationships. Okay? I'm planting seeds. I'm mentoring. It's really funny. When Twitter first came out, the head of technology at Saddleback, who was actually the guy who wrote the Microsoft certification test, came to me and said, hey, Pastor Rick, this thing, Twitter, it's really going to be cool. You got to get on it. I think it's going to go big, and you need to join on it. And he explained it to me, and I go, I can't think anything more narcissistic than to put out there, I just ate a burrito and farted. Okay, so first, why should I tell you that? Second, why should you care? And all it does is stroke my ego. Okay, it's can I be famous? Okay, and I could put a picture of me and a celebrity on social media every day and go, look how cool I am. And what would that do? Would that endear people to me, or would it create more distance? More distance. More distance. So I don't talk about myself on social media unless it's a fault or a weakness. It's not, see how cool I am. Okay, it's because that feeds that celebrity. This is a purpose-driven church, not a personality-driven church. When I wrote Purpose-Driven Life, I was gone for 7 months. I didn't preach a single message except Christmas and Easter. I didn't do a staff meeting for 7 months, and the church grew by 800 people while I was gone. Why? It's a purpose-driven church, not a personality-driven church. Didn't need me to be here for it to keep growing. And so social media is creating more and more of these pseudo-connections. But people are craving, and loneliness is such an epidemic. 60% of England says, I'm lonely, so much so that Theresa May, the Prime Minister, just appointed a new cabinet position called the Minister of Loneliness. There's a Minister of Loneliness in the English cabinet because it's so widespread. When you go onto Google, look for the Cigna, C-I-G-N-A, report on loneliness. They did an extensive study of the health damage that loneliness does to people, and says that loneliness is more worse for your health and will cause you to die younger than smoking 15 cigarettes a day or being obese. Loneliness is worse than obesity or 15 cigarettes a day for your health. That you have to have. We're wired. And this is not news. The very first thing God said to man is, it is not good for man to be alone. What's the antidote to that? Small groups. What the world needs more than anything else in our society today is the antidote to loneliness. And where are they going to get it? Small groups. I want to fire you up to go home and exponentially think your small groups. Add a 0 and say, if we got 30 groups, let's get 300. If we got 50 groups, let's have 500. Okay? Just add a 0 to it. And just start thinking bigger than you've ever thought before. According to your faith, it will be done unto you. Set a big goal for how many new groups you want to start. Now, I don't have any time to go into this. Steve, you could send it to him on email or whatever. But the way you grow small groups is not one at a time every week. but it's by doing these campaigns where you start 50 or 100 or 500 in 1 week. It's the secret sauce of Saddleback Church. It's how we went from a few groups to now thousands and thousands of groups. I'll just tell you this one story that in 2002 when we did 40 Days of Purpose, we do an annual campaign every year. And it's the secret sauce to the growth of Saddleback Church. And there are a lot of biblical principles, actually 18 principles, like multiple reinforcement and concentrated prayer, and you clear the schedule, and there are a lot of principles and multiple learning styles. But in the campaign, which is a 6 or 8 week campaign every year, that's our engine for starting small groups. And we will start, well, in 2002 when we did 40 Days of Purpose, at that time the church was 22 years old and we only had 800 groups. Now that's a lot of groups for most churches, 800 groups, but it was peanuts for a church our size. I still had most of my people not in small groups after 22 years. And I'd been talking it and promoting it for 22 years. I just couldn't get them in until we figured out how to use the campaign. And what we discovered is that we had reversed the way people actually think about groups. We tell people you need to get in a group because you need relationships. That's our primary selling point. You need to be in a group for relationships. And that's true, but it's not the primary hook. Because most people go, yeah, I know. I need more relationships. In fact, I'm even lonely. But I'm just too busy. I don't have time for another meeting in my life. And so even though they know it would be good for them, they go, I don't have the time for it. You have to offer them something in a group they can't get anywhere else. And so we began to get content like Purpose-Driven Life and things like that, where we would offer content. The only place you're going to get this is a small group. And I'm going to teach on it on Sunday morning, but that's the minor part. That's the appetizer. What you really get is the material we're going to give you in the small group. And what we found is people join a group for contact and stay for relationships. They join for content, but they stay for relationships. They don't join for relationships, even though they're lonely. It's kind of like, there are a lot of things good for you too, and you don't do them. Okay? You know a lot of things good for you, you don't do them. So you got to offer a content that is so good that I got to get this. Like, I want to know the purpose of my life. We've done Purpose-Driven Life 3 times in this church. We've repeated it 2 more times. We've done recovery 2 or 3 times. And we're not afraid to repeat stuff because you get a whole new batch of people. But I remember Steve and I and the other pastors were sitting around one day, and our goal for the first campaign of 40 Days of Purpose was 300 new small groups. And I remember going home and God said to me, Rick, your goal isn't requiring any faith. You can do this in your sleep. And I'm pleased when you do something that can't be done in the power of the flesh. So you need a bigger goal. You need to do exponential thinking. I said, what's exponential thinking? And the Lord said, add a 0 to it. So I said, 300 groups, 3,000 groups? You want us to start 3,000 groups in one campaign? So I went back to Steve and I said, Steve, I think God wants you to start not 300 groups, but 3,000 groups. And he goes, all right, Pastor, you're a man of faith. Let's go for it. We're going to go for it. So the next Sunday, I get up on church and I go, guys, we're going to do an 8-week campaign. It's on how to discover the purpose of your life. Who doesn't want to know that? What's the purpose of my life? But this material, you're only going to get it if you're in a small group. Now, we're going to teach it on Sunday, and we're going to give you a book to read every day, and we're going to have memory verses, and we're going to have projects. But the key, it all comes out of that group. All of these things are based in the group. So I said, we don't have enough groups for everybody, and I want everybody to benefit from this. So I need 3,000 of you to become group leaders. Now, Steve's probably already told this, so I'll repeat it. What you call your small group leaders makes all the difference in the world and how many people you're going to get. Because oftentimes the very title scares people. So when we first started small groups at Saddleback, we called our small group leaders lay pastors. Well, that was a terrible name because it scared people. They go, I'm not a pastor, never could be a pastor, never intend to be a pastor, don't know what a pastor does. And so we called it lay pastor. We got dozens of recruits because lay pastor was just too hard. Then Brett Eastman came on staff, and he came from Willow Creek, and he ran our small groups, and we changed the name to Shepherd. That was worse. Shepherds. My people have never seen a sheep. So what's a shepherd do? I'm not a shepherd, never been a shepherd, don't know how to be a shepherd, couldn't be a shepherd. It was a terrible, terrible name for our small group leaders. So then we changed it to small group teacher. And people said, I can't teach, I'm not a teacher, I don't know how to teach, I never will be able to teach, I'm just not a teacher. So then we changed it to small group leader. People said, I'm not a leader. I've never been a leader, couldn't be a leader, don't know how to be a leader, I've never seen myself a leader, I'm not a leader. So I got to thinking, in my church, for every person who has the gift of teaching or leading, I've got 10 people with the gift of hospitality. Hospitality may be the most common gift in the church. And I'll say this now, you're going to hear it from me a lot in the next 10 years. Hospitality is going to be the front door for evangelism in the church in the next decade. Hospitality is the front door to evangelism in the next decade. The more hospitable your church becomes, the more evangelistically effective you'll become. Hospitality is the door to the future in a skeptical, cynical society. But I said, I've got 10 people who got the gift of hospitality for everybody's a teacher or a leader. So we changed the name to host. I'm not a group leader, I'm not a group teacher, I'm not a group pastor or shepherd, I'm just a group host. Well, little old ladies could be a host. A lady who's 95 years old could be a host. She's hosted all of her life. So I get up on Sunday morning and I go, I need 3,000 of you to become hosts. I'm not asking you to do this the rest of your life. I'm not asking you to do it for 10 years until the millennium. I'm asking you to do it for 8 weeks. 6 weeks. Okay? Now, here's what it stands for. H-O-S-T. H. You have to like people. You have to have a heart for people. If you don't like people, if you're a grouch, you can't be a host. So don't even apply. You have to be a lover of people. Hosts have to like people. O. Open up your home. Or meet at a Starbucks or office or what. Open up your home. S. Serve something to drink. Okay. T. Turn on the DVD player. If you can do those 4 things, you can be a host. That day, I said, everybody get out a card. They say, I'll be a host for 6 weeks because I want to know the purpose of life. 3,200 people signed up to be a host. On the spot. Turn them all in. Okay. It's putting the barrier as low as possible. I'm not asking you to do it the rest of your life, just asking you to do it right now. So then I said, okay, now here's the thing. If you just signed up, and I still didn't know how many had signed up because we hadn't counted the cards yet. But at the end of the service, I said, I want you to show up tomorrow night, Monday night, right here in the sanctuary, and I'm going to give you 1 hour of training. You only need 1 hour to be a host. So the next night, 3,200 people show up to be a host. I said, I'm going to give you your packet, your kit with the curriculum and the books and the DVD and all that. I'll give you all the campaign kit. You got to pick it up here. I'm going to give you an hour of training. So 3,200 people show up. So the first thing I say is, now, with a group this big, some of you probably have never stepped across the line spiritually and given your life to Christ. Maybe you're interested in knowing the purpose of life, but maybe you don't know Jesus in a personal way. It would be a pretty good idea for you to know Christ in order to be a host. Does anybody need for me to explain to you how to become a connection to Christ? 17 people raised their hand. Right there in front of those 30. And in front of 3,200 people, I led those 17 people to Christ. Everybody clapped. We all prayed together. Those 17 people gave their life to Christ. Right there. So then I said, now, it'd probably be a good idea if you're going to be a host that you be baptized. Jesus said, this is the way you show that you're following Him. It's in the Great Commandment and Great Commission. Be baptized. So anybody need baptized? That week I baptized 400 people of the host. 400 of the hosts who had never been baptized. Then I said, now we're going to look at your information and we're going to talk to you and we're going to send you out with material. And what we found is that there were some people who weren't quite ready morally. Like they were living together and they weren't married and they were going to host a home in their home. We thought, but we didn't want to say no to anybody. So we said, now, really you need to be married. But I tell you what, we know you're going to work this out, so we're going to make you assistant host. Because we know you're going to get this thing together. And we know you're going to get married and make this thing legit. And all that. So we didn't make him a host, we made him assistant host. So we launched over 3,000 small groups in 1 week. In 1 week. Now, at the end of that 6 weeks, I remember I had 800. Remember I had 800. And we went and when it all boiled out, we ended up with about 2,800 small groups during that 6 period. And I told me I only do this for 6 weeks. At the end of that, I lost 1,000 groups. A lot of them just stopped. Okay, and people, oh man, you lost 1,000. No, I gained 1,000 because I had 800 here. I went to 2,800, and I went back to 1,800. I added 1,000 permanent groups in 6 weeks. That's a pretty good deal. Okay? Now, what we've learned since then is how to not lose these people. The next year, we did it again. We had a big bump, and we gained about 1,000 new groups, and we went back down, but we only lost like 500 of them. And then the next year, we went up, we gained like 500 new groups, but we kept almost all of them, like 400 of them. Now, we don't lose any groups anymore. Because we know before the campaign's over, we've already decided the curriculum they're going to start then, and we have a pep rally for those people and give them the next 6 weeks of material. So we keep them going. So our retention rate is much, much higher. So what I'm saying is you don't grow your small groups like this. Add 1 group a week, 1 group a week, 2 groups, 3 groups. No, you have a group where you go, boom, real high, and then you're going to go down and you'll lose some of them after campaign, but you're up higher than you were before. This is called the pyramiding principle of growth. And you have a big day and you go back down, but you're not as low as you were before. A big day, then you go back down, big day, and go back down. So I leave you with this. Start learning everything you can about loneliness. Start learning. It's going to be the epidemic that opens the side door to the church. Stop worrying about people who are happy pagans and aren't interested. They'll get interested when they get in pain. Now imagine this. What if you were to train your people and to be prepared for the most common pain in life and to invite people? This is a retreat center right here. And God did not give us this retreat center for nothing, but we're going to actually learn to model, to build a number of small retreats that have 15, 20 people, and we might have 3 or 4 retreats going on every single night of the year with 15 or 20 people. And they'll all be related to different hurts. For instance, your neighbor loses a loved one. I lost a son to mental illness 5 years ago, suicide. My youngest son. It was the worst day of my life. And let's say your neighbor, she loses her husband and he dies. What if you were able to go over to that woman and say, I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't imagine what it's like. Our church prays for people in pain. And I like to put your name on our 30-day prayer list, and our church is going to pray for you for the next 30 days. It's just first name only, so it's confidential. Nobody's going to see your full name. But would it be okay if I put you on our 30-day prayer list? Our entire church will be praying for you in the next 30 days. And by the way, here's a brochure about a little retreat called What to Do When You've Lost a Loved One. It's a free overnight retreat, and it's open to about 20 people. And it's free. And we offer it once a month at Saddleback Church. If you're interested in it, I'd be glad to go with you to that retreat, that overnight retreat. Boom. Then you're reading along in the paper one day and you see your neighbor just got fired because of massive layoffs at Toshiba. And after 23 years in the same company, he's got to start all over looking for a new job. And you go to that guy and you go, Joe, I can't imagine what it's like to lose a job after being in the same place for 23 years. And you know what? Our church prays for people in pain. And if you don't mind, I'd like to put your name on our prayer list. And our church will pray for you every day for the next 30 days. Just your first name. It'll be confidential. By the way, we have a retreat. And it's an overnight free retreat. Here's a little brochure on it, on what to do when you're thrust back out into the job market. What to do in the first 6 months after out of work. How to restart the job search thing. And here it is, and it's offered like once a month. And if you want to go, I'd be glad to go with you, or you can just go by yourself. And somebody else comes along, and we have Camp Pendleton here, where they're always flying out for deployments. And say somebody comes back and they said they've been 9 months in Afghanistan, and they said, I can't imagine what it's like to re-enter normal life here after you've been having bullets fly over your head for 9 months. We pray for families that are re-engaging and coming back from deployment. And I'd like to put your name on our prayer list for the next 30 days. And by the way, we have a retreat, and it's called How to Re-Enter Life After Deployment. It's an overnight free retreat. We'll watch your kids, and you and your spouse can come to this retreat. And it's free. Now, in your church, you could have people, you could get the idea, you could have 100 different pains, 100 different hurts out there. Oh, you have a Down syndrome child. I can't imagine what it's like to struggle with, you always have to be on 24 hours a day with somebody in the autism spectrum or special needs of some kind. And you could begin to develop 1, and then 2, and then 3 of these small relational retreats. This is a side door evangelism. Instead of front door, we've got Starbucks coffee and smoke machines. You know what I'm saying? And you're starting where people are hurting. Now, what happens after they do that retreat? It's the funnel to a small group. And you use every retreat to start a small group. It could be a grief recovery group. It could be an after divorce group. It's the first thing that comes out of redeploying. And then you would have members of your church, and there would be a guy who says, you know what? I was never in the armed services, but I had a son who served in Iraq and he died, and I'd like to do anything I could to help those guys. So I'll be a host for that monthly retreat. And I'll help set up the chairs, and I'll help prepare the food, and I'll do whatever I can so that our church can minister to people who are coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder. I think I'm giving you a vision of a new way to do church. And it puts small groups at front and center as the side door to the church, relational. And as persecution increases, relationships will increase. I used to think 40 years ago, Saddleback was built on the idea of people, Donald McGavran said, people should not have to cross cultural barriers to come to Christ. In other words, you got to dress like us to come to Christ. You got to talk like us to come to Christ. You got to like the food. You got to talk. You got to pray like us. You got to like the kind of music. You got to cross cultural barriers to come to Christ. And so, in the early decades of Saddleback, we were looking for ways to lower the cultural barriers so it wasn't that big a jump from unbeliever to believer. We didn't want to put artificial. It's enough saying you got to take up your cross. That's a big enough barrier in itself. I don't need to say you got to wear a white shirt and a tie, or you got to, whatever. And so we were always looking for a way to lower the cultural barriers to show that you could be a Christian and you didn't look like the Amish out there. You weren't that different. I don't believe that works anymore in our society today. I believe the more different we are from society, the more attractive we become. As the world gets darker with sin and evil and more depressed and more lonely and more stressed out, I think if we could teach people how to live on a margin and not be so stressed, people go, I want that. Today, the problem with most people is when they look at other Christians, they are identical to the way they live, except they have more meetings to go to. There's no difference between Christian and non-Christian, except you have 3 extra meetings to go to. No, thank you. Jesus did not say, I've come that you might have meetings. He said, I've come that you might have life. I think the more meetings we have, the more it sucks the life out of us. And so I actually think that the church that is willing to be different, that the more different we are from society, the more attractive it will be. For everybody? No. But for that 25% good seed soil. And you can build a church on 25%. Wow, it's time for lunch.
Yeah.
Have I told you lately that I love you?
We love you too.
I feel, you're the first people I've ever told this to. I feel there's a new book in me that will replace purpose-driven church. I'm just as committed to the 5 purposes of God because they're not ours. They're His. Jesus said, I'll build my church. But I believe that in the new society, when I wrote Purpose-Driven Church, a lot of it's about the front end, about how do you attract the attention of an unbeliever. And then there's a chapter on maturity, and there's a chapter on ministry, and there's no chapter on mission in that book. So only the 4 of the 5 purposes get covered. Why? Because it was one of my early books, and I wasn't Rick Warren, and they said you have to stop at 400 pages. So there was no chapter on mission. Well, I wrote Purpose-Driven Church 15 years into this church. But it's been 25 years since. I'm much wiser. I'm much more mature. I know a whole lot more about ministry and mission and magnification and maturity than I did then. And I do think that it's going to be not the front door, but it's going to be the side doors, and it's going to be the small groups in the next generation. So we need you desperately. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't give up. I always, when I come, Steve invites me to come, or anybody's staff invites me to speak to whoever they've got here, always debate on whether I'm going to deal with personal life or skills. And today I chose skills because I don't know why, but I care about your spiritual life. And we need you to make it to the finish line. When I was 25 years old and started this church, I had some older guys who prayed for me. And they blocked and tackled. I took a lot of criticism. A lot of stuff that nobody even fights over anymore. It was a big issue when I started this church, like drums in the church. Well, that's not an issue anymore. I can give you 100 other things that every church does that were pretty innovative when Saddleback started 40 years ago. But I do believe that those people prayed and kept me going for me. And so about 10 years ago, I made a list of young leaders, pastors and leaders in the church. I thought, I need to be praying for these guys. My guys prayed for me. And I've kept that list. And the tragic thing today is that over half those guys are no longer in ministry. And they're well-known names. And some of them I personally mentored. Some of you won't be serving in ministry 10 years from today. Why? Because you never intended to make it. You weren't that serious about it. It takes sacrifice. It takes discipline. It takes suffering. Just know this, behind every public success, there is always private pain. Behind every public success, there's always private sacrifice and private suffering. And don't ask for this, success unless you're willing to pay the price. Now that sounds kind of negative. I will tell you on the other side of it. I don't know how many years the Lord has left for me, but I do know this. It is so worth it. It is so worth it. The sacrifices, the service, the long nights, the being there when people need you, loving. Let me just say this. Leadership is not about numbers. It's about love. Leadership is not about numbers. It's not about goals. It's not about programs. It's about love. If you love people, they will follow you anywhere. Honestly, if I were to say to Saddleback today, let's charge hell with squirt guns, a lot of people would do it. Why? Because I have spent 40 years of my life loving these people. You can fake love for 2 years. You can't fake it for 40. People figure out pretty quickly whether you love them or not. And I love this church, and I love these people. And I'd rather stick a knife in my heart than hurt any of them. So go back and just become a great lover. Don't focus so much on your programs as focus on loving people.